Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming on this Friday afternoon. I'm Ciaran Martin, Professor of Practice here at the Blavatnik School, former head of the UK National Cybersecurity Centre. And if cybersecurity books are your thing, then you're in for a treat, one of the treats of the year. Delighted to welcome Dr Max Smeets, the author of Ransom War, How Cybercrime Became a Threat to National Security. I'll introduce Max more fully in a moment, but first a little bit on how this is going to work. It's a conversation. I'll ask Max to introduce the book in a minute. I'll ask some questions. At any point, stick your hand up. So there's an announcement for people in the room, an announcement for people online, and then another announcement for people just in the room. So people in the room, stick your hand up at any point. We'll take questions throughout. I've got enough questions to keep us going till 4:30, but I hope I don't have to ask them all because this will be here in your time. For those online, the normal Zoom applies. I have an iPad, which I am semi-competent at. My great secret is I'm not actually very good at operating technology. And then for those in the room, as we speak, even though it was not evident outside, should you remain to the bitter end, then there will be some refreshments outside, and Max will be able to stick around for a little bit before he has to dash back to London for urgent activities. You can say what they are or are not. So Max is a senior researcher at ETH Zurich, one of the best places for cybersecurity scholarship. He is no stranger to Oxford, having done both a DPhil and an MPhil here, so welcome back to here. He is co-director of Virtual Roots organisation that specialises in commentary events and other wonderful products on cyber. Interestingly, and this is a segue into asking you to introduce your new book on cybercrime. I've always associated you as one of the leading scholars of what we might call cyber power or cyber war or cyber in conflict. Cyber as a tool of great power, rivalry, contestation, and so forth. And now you've gone and written a book about a bunch of criminals. So, Max, tell us about the book and we'll get started.
Yeah, that's actually a great starting point, Ciaran, because indeed, for most of my academic career, in fact, even when I started my bachelor studies, I focused on this principle more of cyber war and what all states were doing in this space. I can remember when I was an undergraduate student, I published this poster on cyber deterrence and should we have cyber deterrence. And then I did indeed my MPhil here and I focused on critical infrastructure attacks against the US government by state actors. And then my DPhil focused on the military proliferation in this space. And I continued on that topic when I did my postdoc and my other positions after with slight variations, ultimately then also publishing No Shortcuts, this book on military cyber operations in 2022. And when I published that and after I published that, I could go in a number of different directions, I felt. I could go the easy direction and continue to work on these topics, and they are worthy, of course, of research and enough going on, whether this is the war in Ukraine that deserves a degree of attention as to understanding how cyber is playing out in wartime, whether this is the development in the UK around the National Cyber Force or other developments that, of course, anyone can write on. But I felt it was worthy of moving to cybercrime and specifically ransomware for at least three different reasons. The first one is really because ransomware has these major societal consequences, both at the national security level, and that's what the subtitle of this book refers to, where we have seen really a wide set of incidents over time that had a major security impact. I opened the book with this case of Costa Rica, where the government of Costa Rica in 2022 got hit by a series of rather significant ransomware attacks by this group that I study in more detail called Conti. And it really, I wouldn't say crippled the government, but it really disabled a lot of its functions for a significant period of time, including the ability for some people to not just submit their taxes, but receive their pay slips for several months, et cetera, et cetera. It really showcased, what could happen to a government when such an organization goes after them, to the point that the president declared a state of emergency, calling it a state of war. The first time ever that someone has done this, or a state has done this against a cyber attack. We have seen many more incidents that ultimately raised to the level of national security concern, and an indicator of that we saw in the UK with the COBRA meetings. So these are emergency security meetings that might take place. And a reporter from The Record, Dr Martin, he reported that several years ago, the majority of COBRA meetings were on ransomware over any other national security event. And it's a sort of telling on, how also in the UK governments, started to grapple with it and thinking about how to deal with it. So you have this national security impact. You clearly have this as a business risk, right? Where if you would now ask businesses, what is the cyber risk that we have to prepare for? Many will say we're a lot more concerned about ransomware than about Chinese IP theft or about Russia disrupting our manufacturing business that we're having. And it has these human consequences, right? Where we see so many times, again and again, ransomware groups going after the most vulnerable, because it is exactly the most vulnerable that are likely to pay out. And so what you have is ransomware institutions very frequently going after healthcare organizations and very frequently seeking to leak sensitive data and so on. So one reason, the impact. Second reason is because, especially in 2021, 2022, no academic was looking at it. And especially one that had my background, which is an historical political science, international relations background. It was sort of seen as like crime is this thing that you don't want to focus on the state activity. And anyone that I would ask or tell, I'm now doing ransomware, it's like, you working on crime? Good luck trying to publish that, in a top journal type of thing. But I felt it was needed and deserved its own sort of analytical focus and research. So that's the second, and still today, no journal article in the top 150 top journals in cyber conflict has published on ransomware. And then the third, it's remarkable, or maybe I don't know where it's remarkable. Now the third one is the data, right? Like there's so much information there on ransomware from the CTI community, but also the leaks that I've used that is just underexplored, that there's a real opportunity here. And one of the things that happens a lot with ransomware groups is that their internal either chat messages or their other infrastructure gets leaked. That has to do for a variety of reasons I can go into, but they're very prone to these kind of OPSEC failures. And here I, in my book, used the leaks of a group called Conti. They were far the biggest group in 2021, biggest ransomware group. Made a profit between 180 million and 1.2 billion in 1 year. That's quite considerable. And almost all of their chat messages got leaked online. And that provides us, as a result of it, a unique opportunity to basically, understand what they're talking about, how they're thinking about going on in their business, and providing an inside view. And so that's sort of why I wrote on it, and why I also moved away from the military space. Maybe I'll come back at some point, but I thought it was definitely worthy to write this book today and stick with that.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, let's take a step back. Looking around the audience, there's a mixture of people who I know are deep cyber experts. There's some more generalists. I think it's the same online. So I'll ask all the tough questions.
Great.
Number one, what is ransomware? And I'm not just asking you that for the generalists who may not be familiar with it, but actually even amongst the cybersecurity specialists, sometimes we argue about what it is. So when you're writing a book about ransomware, what are you on about?
And it's a really great question, because actually the term doesn't apply to most of the activity that we're talking about. It's a really bad term for it, and I'll get to it why in a second. But maybe just to sort of lively things up, it's worth going back in history and thinking about a couple of incidents that took place and where we started and where we were. So the very first case of what can be called ransomware took place in the late 80s. And this is when people visited the World's AIDS Conference, the 4th World's AIDS Conference. And after they visited it, they received one of these floppy disks in their mail. And this floppy disk had a seemingly program on there that would ask anyone who installed it a couple of questions related to their behavior. It would ask them questions like, how many sexual partners have you had? Which countries have you visited? Et cetera, et cetera. And then it would spit out a percentage that would say, you have a 75% risk of contracting AIDS. And if that risk would be very high, it would then provide a message that you would sort of find now at the back of a cigarette box with like, your lifestyle is dangerous, please change it. So really like, a really weird program that these people receive in the mail. But if they rebooted their computer, sometimes between 30, sometimes 40, 50 times, a different message would appear. And this message was a seemingly software license where everyone was locked out of their computer and you would have to pay just under 200 US dollars to regain access. And then you had to write this invoice to a specific address in Panama where then hopefully you get this decryption key to get back into your computer.
Wow.
This was all written by a Harvard-educated biologist called Joseph Popp, and who ultimately got caught, but actually didn't spend any time in jail because he was considered to be insane. Anyway, a long story, he wasn't really insane because he then later set up a butterfly conservatory in upstate New York that is still there. But all the story goes to tell, here you have this one individual that is sort of like riding this ransomware, and actually, you know, in the end, he didn't make any money because no one was sending this check to Panama, except for one entity, and that was Scotland Yard, just to see if he would actually send. And no one lost any of their data, with one or two institutions maybe at most, because someone was very easily able to write a decryption key.
Okay.
So it's like, you know, we were talking here about a few hundreds. Yeah. Exactly. Where we are today is we have these groups asking for millions at times, right? These are groups, not individuals. And they are not just doing ransomware in a way where they try to lock you out of your system. No, they are first of all primarily focused on encrypting your data. And that's sort of the ransomware element. And then, you know, you have to pay them to decrypt it. But also they've extended it with multiple forms of extortion, meaning that they also steal your data, set up what we call a leak site or a shame site, where if you don't pay, we put this data online, and then maybe explore with other forms of extortion, that it be, if you don't pay, we are continuing to DDoS attack you and disrupt your network all the time. And so you see, you know, the space has dramatically changed, and with that going after ever bigger enterprises, what some would now call big game hunting, and with, of course, a number of other elements in there too, not least the reliance on cryptocurrency, right? That has allowed for the really scalability of ransomware, with payments no longer going through a cashier's check or through a gift card of $100, but suddenly, you know, entities can pay much larger amounts over, of course, larger distances too, even if it is not always anonymous. And so what is ransomware today is actually, when we talk about it, is really digital extortion. It has often an encryption element because someone has got an unauthorized access and encrypted data. So it's a ransomware comes from ransom and malware, but it is actually more than that. Wow. It is now like these groups, these criminal organizations experimenting really with these additional forms of extortion to put pressure on victims.
Okay, so let me get this right. So what you mean by ransomware, it's a digital extortion that can take multiple forms. At its core, it's locking people out of their network, so they're bleeding money and inability to function, so they're desperate, so they pay you to get back in, but you can experiment with that, so you can blackmail them with release of data, with further attacks and so forth. That's ransomware. Okay, so it's a form of cybercrime. Everyone here and watching will be familiar with other forms of cybercrime. There'll be scams, there'll be all sorts of other things, but let's take scams. Many people here will have been scammed, including, I will not hesitate to admit, me. We'll all know somebody who's been scammed. We hemorrhage money from the economy. It's all very traumatic and so forth, but I haven't heard any government or serious scholar, as you absolutely are, describe it as a national security risk, as a national security threat. So why have you, I mean, you mentioned one case, Costa Rica, state of emergency, but why have you come to elevate this form of cybercrime as a national security threat in a way that other forms of this huge global racket are not?
Yeah, in some ways, or in many ways, I'm not saying something unique here, right? In fact, if you now read, the UK put a consultation out last 2-3 weeks ago on ransomware, it will say ransomware is the biggest cyber threat and is a significant threat to national security, right? Okay. That's the language that is now explicitly in there, right? So I'm not saying that I'm someone who is arguing it's a national security threat. What you see is a growing number of governments being very explicit that it is. And I follow that perspective because of, sort of in the simplest way to say, because of the severity of incidents that we have seen and the number of incidents. And that comes from whether this is UK healthcare that is being hit, where you suddenly see, and this is really terrible cases, where you see the lack of available blood and other things, the number of appointments that are being rescheduled, including like very serious appointments related to cancer that are quite urgent, all of those things. And it's that case, but then we can equally point to 25 other cases in the same year, whether this is, a small municipality that is hit in Germany that is responsible for the water infrastructure in a slightly wider region, where they're having to scramble, other ways in which they're able to provide this to the local community. So it's such a wide set of targeting across so many sectors with such a repeatability of consequences, that governments, as well as myself, see it as a national security threat. Why it is not necessarily a security threat, but I might exaggerate it, is its link to the state, right? And when I started my research, that was almost the reason to study it, or not for me, but why people thought it was worth enough. It's a security threat because all these criminals, they're actually connected to the Russian government. Mm. That might be the case, and we can maybe talk about that a bit more, of what is exactly their link to the state. But it's independent of whether they are linked or not. We've seen them repeatedly having the resources to conduct these major operations. And I don't know if if it's useful to give more examples of what has happened, but
yeah, please.
To pick one more well-known case is, for instance, Colonial Pipeline. So we saw a group that went after a seemingly less known entity, at least before the attack, in the United States, that was responsible for the distribution of oil and gas across the entire east coast of the United States. After it got hit, the group didn't get access to their operational infrastructure, but to their billing infrastructure and then several other systems. They shut down, and it led Biden to sign an executive order to, again, find real ways to get this oil across the entire coast, whether this was now instead of through pipes with trucks, ships, and so on. We saw panic buying in places like Georgia, where suddenly when the news broke, everyone, of course, went to the petrol station to get this last, drip of oil. And it's, again, really those cases of entities that people have never heard of before that, of course, play critical roles in our society and really impact either governments as a whole or at least the daily lives of individuals.
And just in terms, we'll come on to the links to states in terms of the attacker side in a minute, but in terms of the victim side, so far in this conversation, you've mentioned the US, Colonial, the UK, hospitals, Germany, municipalities, and Costa Rica, the state of emergency. But just interested, to what extent is this predominantly, from your research, a perhaps rich country, Western world problem? To what extent is it a global threat?
So we see ransomware groups having a strong interest in targeting particularly US or UK entities. And that's for a number of reasons, right? First of all, is because there are a lot of entities that are able to pay up after you got access. Second is it's very clear that there is especially an anti-American sentiment amongst those often Russian-based criminal groups. So there is a degree of justification for them internally. It's almost, certainly not Robin Hood-like, because they don't give the money then later away, but hey, we can steal from those imperialists. And you would see that language explicitly stated in the in the leaked chats from, for example, Conti, but we also know this from other groups. So that's the second reason. And the third reason is the ease. Going after English-speaking countries is easier because it's easier to write a phishing email and it's easier to understand the data that you have just stolen. So I'd rather, go after maybe an English-speaking entity than even a Danish entity potentially, because I might even not know if this is especially a local one that is really having all this document in that language. It just might take me a little bit more time, despite all the translation tools, to figure out what is going on and make my way through the system and so on and so on. So there are sort of three reasons. Now that said, it is changing. So what we've seen, particularly from 2022, is a lot of Spanish-speaking countries that have been targeted. And some of that might have just been almost accidentally partly accidentally. Why? Is because you get access to one target, and then because you get access to one Spanish-speaking entity that has lots of customers, you then go after those as well. Yeah. So we've seen a little bit of that, but it's also because there are now way more tools available to go after them, right? And you may not get 2 million, but actually 200K of a very badly protected organization. That's probably worth days of effort as well for some of those criminals. So we've seen targeting becoming more globalized, but so it's not as strong anymore, but you do still see a lot of the targeting taking place against the US and other Western entities.
And is it the same people? We'll come to the threat actors in detail in a minute, but in terms of, say, the Spanish language ones, do you think it's the same people based out of Russia, or are they in a Spanish-speaking country, or where are they from?
So what the Conti leaks have shown, so again, these leaks really provide this unique inside overview, right? Where you have this overview of all these identities of different people that are using Persona, where you can figure out what their operational teams are, what type of guidebooks they are using for their operations. They didn't set up a specific team within this 120-person organization at a time that it was like regional focused. I was like, this team is going to target entities in Asia, this team is targeting entities in the US, and this team is targeting entities in Latin America. Right. No. So it's not in that way. At the same time, you do get people that are starting to specialize in getting access to certain organizations. So either that specialization is based on knowledge of their systems, okay, or that specialization indeed comes from language, from benefits in the language that they're speaking for phishing, and et cetera. And so it's often the same one, but you might see then, someone who is now starting to understand those organizations, may have some language skills, go after this more and more and more.
Right. By the way, feel free to ask, stick your hand up and ask questions. I've got a couple online already. But look, before we go any further, you've dropped in the Conti group on numerous occasions so far. Who on earth are these people? Where do they live? How old are they? Many of them are there. How do they work? When I was growing up in the 1980s, Conti meant a Scottish actor of Italian descent. Who are the Conti group? What do they do?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, Conti was the biggest ransomware group in 2021 by both the number of cryptocurrency payments made to wallets linked to them and by the number of attacks. And in 2021, it was quite a monopolized space. They were really owning almost like 70 or maybe 80, depending on how you calculate it, of the entire sort of ransomware industry. Okay. And this group was one that was, and then in following the further invasion of Ukraine, an individual going by the pseudonym Danilo leaked the chat messages. Okay. This person was Ukrainian, disgruntled, or more than that, extremely angry by what was happening in his or her country, with the tanks rolling across the border, and decided to leak all those chat messages online because also internally there was a lot of anti or pro-Putin sentiment, and the group publicly posted that they were supporting Putin in this war. So they're Russian? And they are, as a result of it, primarily Russian. And you see this group that is led by an individual called Stern. And Stern is his persona name. We actually don't know his real name. And has a number of other people around him, a sort of inner circle. And that inner circle are people that often get paid in percentage per operation. And you should almost see them as sort of partners of a company. But then they also have a lot of people that are just on their payroll, right? So this could be someone that they literally recruited from a job advert site for maybe $100 US a month salary, and that person is responsible for the human resources or the advertisement and doing the leak sites. And maybe only in 2 months' time, when they're in the organization, they realize that they're in the ransomware business. So you see an organization that is, first of all, really an organization. And second of all, one with a range of different skills of people that have often known each other for quite a few years, that have come out of other ransomware groups or have come out of entirely other criminal businesses. So many of them come from the credit card stealing business and then selling those on. But also others come from what we call the botnet criminal gangs that are selling access or botnet capabilities to other groups. So you see this constellation of individuals. But over time, they become more and more business-like. They are starting to think about the practices that they have to implement to make sure that they're operating in a good way. So they start to think, wait a second, we need to hire this team that can help us in better understanding the type of organizations we are targeting. So they get this Zoom Info license that gives you a sense of the size of companies. And then, you have people that analyze it so they can better negotiate. Or they start to think more carefully about the negotiation themselves, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the organization. And at the top, that person Stern, he is quite a business-minded individual in thinking about both ransomware, but also thinking about other criminal industries and how he needs to maybe invest his money in there.
But every so often, British or American or somebody else, law enforcement, not with the Conti group, because I don't think they ever identified any of these people, but they identify they put their photos up, they slap warrants on them, they try and freeze any bank accounts they may or may not have in the West. So what do we know about these people? Because you make them sound like sort of chief executives of well-run organizations. Are they wearing suits and ties? Are they operating in the dark of night? Or are they just, going in 9 to 5? I mean, what are these people like? What are they doing? What sort of lifestyle do they have, insofar as we can ever know?
So if you would just purely look at the number of when chat messages are sent, you see that this is a 9 to 5 job, right? With the majority of messages being sent at 2 p.m. This is not your hacker that is doing this after work. No, this is them doing this from 9 to 5, or some doing this at different times, and regularly communicating with them. With each other, and then you will have in the chats something like, okay, and now I have to go, let's wrap up this negotiation, I have to pick up my kids from school.
And do they have meetings and stuff? And
of course they do. And also there are discussions between this guy Stern and his right hand, Mango, about should we set up physical office spaces in St. Petersburg, right? And then they are talking about these 2 office spaces in St. Petersburg, and then the pros and cons of thinking whether, setting up these physical office spaces actually will, whether this is a good thing or not. And Stern is saying, no, remote work is fine. Whereas Mango is saying, no, we need to monitor those people more, right? So you see that. Now, at the same time, there are massive...
So they're having a culture war over working from home.
Exactly. That's great. Right?
Excellent. Okay, right.
And that's remarkable, right? Or like thinking, they have a bonus malus system, right? Like if you're a bad employee of the month, then you're not getting your salary. And if you're a good employee, you do get it. So there's actually a bonus malus system, that is in place there. And there's a committee that votes on it and takes it very serious, right? But equally, they're extremely inefficient.
Okay.
Right? Understandably so in many ways. Let's be clear, right? Like, it's so easy to say, you did this wrong and these guys are not communicating and you're both targeting the same entity. But good luck. Trying to run an organization at some point of over 100 individuals, where you are trying to, you don't even know where everyone is based, and you're trying to like set this up. That's and you're seeing yourself scaling from 10 million a year to 50 million a year to 100 plus million a year in revenue. Well, any startup would be struggling, right? So that plus what you see is, let's not over fetishize the sort of exciting activities that these people are doing. First of all, is of course these are dreadful people, but second of all, it's often super mundane tasks, right? You get people that are like, man, this is so terrible. Like they can be trying to target entities for months without success. No one is clicking on the phishing email, poor them. They might be having to go for 2 days just through data to figure out what is there, to make sure that they can have better negotiations, waiting for an answer. They're trying to write this tool, scraping tool that is not working. They are working with there are a lot of mundane tasks, I guess also like any other business, that they're just extremely frustrated about, or frustrated about pay, frustrated about, not being able to go on holiday, frustrated about a variety of those things. So what Conti was a real business. Now, being clear, they are actually no longer the model for what we see today.
Okay.
And I think that is an important one, right? We see different models of ransomware groups. Conti, in its size, is rather unique, but it's also in its hierarchical setup, it's rather unique. It's this setup with, at some point, 3 teams with an operational lead that are doing that. This very quite clear structuring. Today, instead, you see organizations, ransomware groups that don't have everything in-house, but where you have a small team that owns the encryption device and decryption device, so the ransomware itself, that sets up the communications infrastructure between the victim and the payment infrastructure at times as well. And once they own that, they don't do anything else. Okay. So initial access brokerage, that is done by others, and they pay that. Then actually, targeting or leveraging that to gain further access in the victim's network, again, another group. Negotiations might be done by another group. The payout might be done by another group. All of these different things are essentially then outsourced. So what you have is groups today operating under sort of some more outsourcing, some less outsourcing, and some, as a result of it, being more careful about who they may or may not target and how they want to scale up, and others don't.
But this is all criminal activity. So you make it sound like, as well as an ordinary business organization, we need to come back to that, but you make it sound, this outsourcing stuff, like ordinary business transactions with contracts and so forth, but presumably they don't have legally binding contracts because all the activity is illegal. So how does it work? How do you know if you're the person who's going to deliver the payout, or if you're contracted to deliver the payout, so you get all the money because that's what you do? How then does it flow? How does it operate? Given that there's no legal, you're not going to take to some international court of arbitrage to get your share if somebody doesn't work. So how does this ecosystem work? Yeah,
they have been experimenting with this really since 2018, especially when they started to outsource. So early on, the way that this was done was that entity that was having the ransomware would say, okay, after you've done your operation and you've successfully extorted this victim and they're going to pay, they have to pay us in our wallet, and then we will pay you out for your percentage.
Okay.
Right? And then it's a sort of like the affiliate who is doing that, or the operator, has to worry whether they receive the money from the ransomware group, essentially the set of individuals that own it. But over time, the balance has sort of shifted. So now the payout is different. It's often a 20-80% payout. So often 20% goes to the sort of core group. But the way that this is happening now is actually it's the affiliate or operator that does the initial operations. They are getting the money, and then they give that percentage to the organization. And the idea is that, they have to give that percentage. And because if they don't do that, they don't get access to the locker after that anymore. So we have to jump. And this happens. And you would see groups. So there is this group that was the biggest one after Conti, called Lockbit. That group was operating under this model. And they changed it. The affiliate gets the money, so they are more incentivized to work with Lockbit because there's less risk on the affiliate. But there, the head of the group would come into the chat when the money when it would be coming too high. When it was going to serious money and he was afraid that he was going to lose out on his percentage, he would take over.
Right.
So you, of course, see distrust between them, and you see them sort of competing there as well.
I'm going to take, there's one question here, if that's right, just on this.
The complexity and the sophistication of the network that you just described, it seems unlikely that the security apparatus of the country that they are operating from, that they're not aware of it.
Yeah, so if just to repeat it in case it wasn't heard online, how can you do this without police security services knowing about it? It's too big, which leads us into the question of, I mean, we're talking Conti, they're a predominantly Russian group, so we'll come on to other countries in due course. But yeah, what do the Russian state think of these people?
So
why are they able to operate?
It's a brilliant question, right? So you see these groups being predominantly operating from Russia, although even they themselves, if you're a student, might not know where everyone is operating from. If this individual who's part of your group is in Siberia, Romania, Ukraine, or Belarus, but predominantly Russia, especially the leadership. And one thing that comes very clear from Conti in the leaks is that they do what they call pioneering activities. So these are activities that they do, essentially volunteering activities for the Russian state and specifically the FSB. There is no indication that they do it for the GRU, so no destructive, but they're mostly doing espionage, intel collection activities for the FSB. And essentially that the way in which they are functioning is that these groups have developed so much skill and knowledge of getting access to hard targets is that the FSB will ask them at times to go after targets of their interest. And so one of the most prominent cases is a journalist that they targeted that was part of a collective called Bellingcat, an open source investigative journalist network. And that journalist was working on Navalny-related research and helping that team, clearly of great interest to the FSB. And Conti was asked, essentially by them, to do that activity. Now, there are other cases, in fact, also one where they're going after a bank, and there seem to be suggestions that they were interested in some covert-related matters as well, because let's be clear here, this group was operating in 2020, 2021, 2022. So you see that link to the state. That said, they are not deeply integrated, right? These groups making such a significant profit with this head at some point having almost 100 million US dollars in Bitcoin in his wallet and others being extremely rich, they want to continue making money. And every time that they have to focus on activity for the FSB, they cannot focus on making money, right? So they are sort of like balancing that out, knowing that they may have to play that, but equally, wouldn't want to just consistently be working for them. Now, the links between ransomware, especially leadership, and the Russian government, of course, differs from group to group. We have seen other groups, Evil Corp, where a name of another group, where they're almost like very close family ties with very senior Russian government officials, or a group called Yang Li Wang, which is, sounds maybe like an Asian group, but was actually a Russian group. That group, we know that an FSB officer was one of their key, operators. So you see the links between certain groups in the state are not always the same, but they are very clearly there. And I should have started with the fact that this all starts with a quid pro quo, which is that these groups can do their business, but only by not targeting any Russian entities or any Russian affiliated entities. So they would never go after Russian business. And what people forget is that it's not how it used to be. So we have seen ransomware in the early 2000s, where Russian individuals would go especially after Russian individuals because it was much easier, because they knew, how to write that phishing email in their language. They knew which websites to go after. These were often soft targets. But that's a massive transition, right? And so we now see a space where they would never go after Russian entities, although sometimes they freak out because they might just hit them. They don't realize. So it very often happens that these groups simply get access to a network prior to exactly knowing which entity this is, but they essentially pivoted into it. Or it's like sort of cases where one case that I describe in the book is from graph jewelry, a high-end jewelry case. Like, and all of the, at some point actually, when the Daily Mail finds out, all of that, the records from people that were buying from the graph were being put online, and it included from many pop stars or now presidents like Donald Trump or Madonna, but it also had like a couple of crown princes in the Middle East. Now, you see them at some point half panicking and writing a public message. It's like, sorry, we of course do not want to offend, you, whatever Crown Prince X. So it's an interesting thing because, on how they sometimes have to go back later to sort of apologize as well or freak out and how to do this in crisis mode.
So thanks for the question. We'll take any more questions in a bit, but just on that, I mean, what was implicit, but for the more generalists in the audience, might as well make it explicit. What you're saying is that these people aren't hiding from the Russian authorities. The Russian authorities know who they are, but there are two quid pro quos, as I heard you. One is you don't attack Russians, and the other is you give some help to at least one of the state authorities. Is that broadly?
Yeah, I mean,
right?
Of course, we shouldn't assume, although they will have a good visibility in top leadership, that the Russian state knows the identity of every single individual that is operating in that group, right? So there is also a lack of telemetry there.
Sure.
And indeed, they aren't hiding, but they're also they equally don't want to be completely co-opted. And we have seen, although this is speculative, we have seen the Russian government prior to the first invasion of Ukraine arresting individuals that were part of ransomware groups, most prominently REvil. What some have argued is that these individuals weren't arrested for the necessary illegal activities and the requests coming from the US, but also because these were potentially folded into the Russian government's hacking apparatus to then help them. And so there are multiple dynamics here going on.
And just on not attacking Russians, is it true, as I've seen written, that some of these attacks technically were coded, that if they found Russian script, they would leave it alone, and therefore some Western cybersecurity companies started installing covertly Russian script into their network so that they would go away? Is that right?
Well, what is the simplest way to do it is often just whether it uses a Russian keyboard or not.
Right.
So that is like what you will see a lot. And indeed, if it is like Russian keyboard settings, then we don't go after it. Or but there are a variety of ways in which you want to seek to sift out whether you're going after a Russian network or not. But you can see again that this might, this is never watertight.
So if you're an American conglomerate, you just have a handful of Russian keyboards.
If everyone were using a Russian keyboard, maybe the chances of being targeted is a bit less. Yes.
Now, I wanted to take you to, you keep mentioning 2021, which is a big sort of catastrophic year, for ransomware victims, a bountiful year for ransomware attackers. But when you're talking about ransomware as a national security threat, and this goes to the heart, I think, of your question about the Russian state. So you had Colonial Pipeline, you talked about it. Yeah. And you hadn't had the full-scale invasion of Ukraine because it was 2021. And you had, so it was still okay for President Biden, remember him, and Putin to meet. And they met in Geneva in, I think, September of 2021. And the US briefed out in advance that they had 3 big items they wanted to talk about. I can't remember what the other 2 were. Interestingly, Ukraine was not one of them because the whole intelligence disclosures hadn't happened yet. They briefed out 3, and one of them was the Russian harboring of ransomware criminals. So firstly, an observation that shows, I think, at least partly validates the overall thesis of your book, which is this is a national security issue if it's one of the President of the United States' top 3 issues. But secondly, Where did that lead, and where might it lead in the future? Did Joe Biden raising this make any difference at all? And what does that say about the relationship of these people to the Russian state?
Yeah, I have to exactly go back. It is actually somewhere for a few paragraphs in my book on the exact chronology of like Biden having that meeting and then also leading to the R-Evil arrest. But I believe they follow quite quickly after. And, you know, that is clearly not a coincidence. But the question is really like, what is Putin signaling here? He didn't, you know, arrest any of the high-end individuals. No, instead, he went after the sort of money mules. And if you see also what they were ultimately arrested for, they were arrested not for the hacking of businesses, but they were arrested for money laundering. So it's a sort of like sliver. But it was a sort of like maybe a signal to do that. Now, I think, you know, maybe the US can see this as a win, but this is a massive win actually for Putin, right? To occasionally arrest reels these other groups back in. What you very clearly saw with the Conti leaks is that they started to panic, right? Like, they were like, but this can maybe happen to us as well. The next time that they get one of these pioneering requests, they better take this really serious. And I really think that it had a dynamic just happening prior to the further invasion of Ukraine. The moment that you saw the invasion happening, them coming out, most of them very publicly, is like, we support Putin here. I really do think that there was this, you know, part of that fear of, you know, what could happen to them. Because let's be clear, most of those ransomware groups are not afraid of being arrested by the US government, but they are afraid of, you know, being arrested or something else happening to them by the Russian government.
So you're saying it was like a criminal version of the tech bros all lining up behind Trump at the inauguration, but it was just for cyber criminals? Brilliant. If there are any questions, happy to take them. But if not, I wanted to move on just to beyond Russia. So we've talked, I mean, is this a Russia problem if you, I mean, Putin, even Putin is bound by the limits of mortality. There may be, well, there will be a new regime in Russia at some point. If there was some sort of reform and it became a less hospitable place for cybercrime, would this problem go away, or is it kicking off elsewhere?
By and large, it is a Russia problem, but not a Russia-only problem. And first of all, it comes with a caveat that it actually has always been a Ukraine, Russian, Belarusian, Russian-speaking problem. What people forget is that Ukraine is the original hotbed of cybercrime. The very first cybercrime meeting was held in Odessa. Jonathan Listhouse here in Oxford actually wrote a great book on that. And the whole carding market and everything that followed from it, you know,
what do you mean by the first cybercrime meeting? Did they have a conference?
They had a conference, a physical conference where they met up. Exactly.
When was this?
I have to look it up, but it must be probably like 90s or something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
So, you know, here you have this like genuine meeting around, you know, how to be a cyber criminal, and then it was still very much, again, carding and those type of businesses, and at some point it's stealing banking credentials to actually directly access. But it's that, and you get that space that continue to evolve, and many have come out of that before they moved to ransomware. And early on, ransomware was not a cool thing to do. It was not sort of seen as a cool way as a criminal to earn money in a way. And that has continued. And again, also Conti was a group that had a lot of Ukrainians in there, and still today groups will very likely have quite a few Ukrainian individuals still being part of them. So that is sort of one remark on how we have to think about it. And then we see a splintering of sometimes individuals across the world. And unfortunately, what we have seen are a couple of particularly worrying constellations. One of them is a group called Scattered Spider, one that particularly the US government has been very worried about. It's because of its sort of extreme forms of extortion, where when I talked about these multiple forms of extortion, they really started to experiment with physical extortion as well. It's like, if you don't pay, we're going to hire a hitman to go after you. Hey, CEO, and we're coming to your house. We know where you're living now from stealing your documents. It's that type of physicalness, that brazen physicalness that we didn't see before. And a lot of people from Scattered Spider were across the world, arrested in Israel or in other places, being in their teenage years or in their early 20s. There's a big open question today around how this spreads further to a variety of other countries, whether this is, countries where we see other scams, the extortion scams that often come from places like Nigeria, whether they will at some point move towards ransomware, or whether this is other scams that we see particularly in places like India or Pakistan. One other exception is North Korea. North Korea is a remarkable one because it has a history of state actors seeking to conduct cyber operations for profit reasons, but they went often after cryptocurrency exchanges directly. We've seen them doing ransomware operations. The most famous one is WannaCry, right? You will know more about this, and it cost you probably many sleepless nights in trying to deal with this at the time. But now, what a lot of North Korean state hackers are doing is they are inserting themselves in this broader process. Right. So what these North Korean hackers do is they gain access. They know how to do that. But then they hand this over to a Russian criminal group. Right. And they get paid for it by doing this initial access.
And that's their job. They're not just doing this sort of part-time or...
So that's still the open question. Likely that's their job, but it's not what people often assume is that these groups that are cyber groups within the North Korean government essentially have to self-fund themselves. Right. So they are sort of like the Russians, the state demands them to find ways to fund themselves and potentially also the state.
Right. Well, we should move on in a minute. I'll take a question online, but absolutely fascinating sort of insight into these people with conferences and leadership development programs and arguing about working from home, whilst at the meantime causing national security crises all over the world. We have one question from Eliana, which was asked at the start, and it may be a brief answer because it may be not that you know of, but it was, are there any groups or actors that sort of specialise in ransomware attacks against state infrastructure? So a lot of the money will be in the private sector, but a lot of the impact that we've talked about can be in public institutions. So are there any sort of ones that just target governments? Because that might lead to a little bit of a suspicion about what their real motives are.
Yeah, you see pockets of, so these groups are now they are now becoming mostly not the Conti model, but as I mentioned, these groups where one entity is responsible for the encryption and decryption. This is essentially the brand. And then there are different people that are essentially handing over the access or the operation. And so you've got these small, sometimes groups working in 3, 4, 5 people that are doing targeting. And we have seen cases where if you track these groups, that they have a particular, for whatever reason, going after particular entities, and one of those was going after a lot of German municipalities. And it might be that they sort of had a playbook at a given point in time, where they're like, if I can hit that municipality, let me look up which other municipalities are there and see if they have the same system. Okay. And so you see that. You don't see today groups being, so that is one. And then what you see is, talking about interests, you see, for instance, China using ransomware very interestingly too. So this is state-led ransomware.
What does that involve?
So it's a PLA unit that uses ransomware, but they go then after businesses that are, or organizations that are relevant for the Chinese state when it comes to stealing the data. What is essentially happening here is that they don't care about the ransomware, but they care about the stealing of the data. Okay. But what they do is they get in, and we've seen this case of a group called Camel Gang operating in Latin America. They get into someone's network, they steal the data because this is relevant for the Chinese state for political reasons or economic reasons. But then they conduct the ransomware operation in crypto systems, maybe even do some other extortion. Why? It's because it muddies the waters. Okay. Now it's extremely hard to know for maybe the business, but also for the government, were they interested in our data, or are they doing it for money? And sometimes it's helpful for a business because they can point to the state and say to the government, it's like, nothing to worry about really here for national security reasons. This was just a business incident, but we've dealt with it. We have the decryptor. Okay. So you see some interesting dynamics playing out.
And very quickly, before we move on to responses, it's a global school. We sometimes get very sensitive about having a very Western view of the world. So have you seen any evidence of Western states either undertaking this type of activity or indeed tolerating it in the way that, for example, Russia clearly does? Are we okay?
So So there are individuals, and I don't know if I made it explicit. So Scatter Spider was a group where a lot of individuals are based in Western countries,
Right.
and some of them are, kids from rich backgrounds or whatever, and not even, I don't know, doing it for the thrill or whatever it is, mixed with making more money. There are no significant state-led groups that we know of in most countries, but one comes to mind though, and it's a group called NB65.
Who are they?
So this is a group that was established, that is a Ukrainian group, and so after actually the Conti leaks, and after all of their entire playbook was published online, what happened was a lot of different groups started to use that playbook.
Right.
Some of them started to use that playbook for for-profit reasons, right? Other Russian groups started to learn on how to use that. NB65 was a Ukrainian patriotic group with not clear ties to the Ukrainian government, but they could very well exist, that was starting to do ransomware operations against Russia. And supposedly, the proceeds of all of their ransomware attacks would go to the Ukrainian war effort.
Understood. Wow. Again, feel free to ask questions. We've got a couple online. Yeah. And I'll come to you in a sec, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. Absolutely fascinating. On the issue that Ciaran just mentioned, I mean, it reminds me so much of sort of 17th century privateering, sort of, collaboration between states and governments. But if there's not Western efforts to do that, and I don't think there should be, what's the best way to sort of respond without, debasing to these kind of tactics? And on the tactics, we've talked about how it can be used for corporate espionage, for gaining intelligence on U.S. security systems, and also the economic aspect. Has there been examples of using these groups to collect compromat, to put pressure on key political leaders or business leaders, to push them in a political direction, the way that compromat used to be used, but gathered through human sources?
So there are a couple of groups. So to understand, to answer that question, you need insider information about how these groups are tasked and why they are tasked, and who they are exactly going after at times too. We have this insider information for Conti. We have this to some degree with other leaks as well, including Yang Luang, but even the logbit data that was obtained by the NCA doesn't have that. So there's a limited visibility. But clearly, that type of behavior, as any other thing that the FSB might be interested in, is something that you could very well expect in these groups doing. So I can't point to you to one specific example that we know of, but we also may have only, we might be only aware of a few % of the total tasking that has been given. So I expect it to be there. I can't give you, unfortunately, a good case. So, but for now, it's just hypothetical.
And on the flip side, the only thing I'd add is that there are examples of these guys' activities embarrassing the Russian regime. So sometimes, for example, the attack on the Irish healthcare system clearly was not on the plan of the Kremlin. They got a bit out of it. Take one on the back and then come.
Very simple.
It's supposedly a war. How many people are being killed? And if none, why none? Why aren't the state actors killing people? I mean, that's the best way you end a war, isn't it, when you start killing people?
So it's hard to put a number on the number of people that have been killed due to ransomware, but there is interesting data. A study has been done in the US where it focused on increased mortality rates following a ransomware incident due to appointments being postponed, surgeries that couldn't take place, and so on and so on. And there they showcase that the mortality rate at a given hospital, on average, increases between 17 and 25% at a given point in time. Unfortunately, it means that I haven't done the numbers of collecting all the cases against, for instance, healthcare institutions, and then making from that further calculating how many people have died. But that is a sort of gives you a sense of potentially times where you do see the real human consequences. There might also be individual cases where they sometimes can be more clearly or less clearly linked, but then they come often from a degree of embarrassment. So one of the cases exists with a psychiatry clinic in Finland, which was actually done by a single individual. And this clinic or network of clinics had a lot of data from teenagers, and teenagers having a variety of health problems, also sharing information about their relationship with their parents and so on. And after the healthcare clinic network decided to not pay, what happened was the leaking of that data online. Now, it's hard to know whether reported suicide cases actually were directly the result caused by the leaking of this data, but some have made that claim. So unfortunately, I can't give you a complete number of deaths.
More about assassination.
Sorry. So.
Well, yeah, and just I was going to ask when we come to the. So I mean, there have been some people. I mean, ransomware tends to disrupt and cause economic damage in healthcare. It does kill people. It's hard to. But I was going to ask when we come to the bit about response, but we take it now. I've seen it suggested, mostly from US people, but now from somebody right here in Oxford, that look, if this was terrorism affecting hospitals, the US would probably undertake drone strikes or covert assassinations. Now, they're in Russia, which might change the geopolitical thing, but, there's your answer. There's the question, given the severity of this is happening, should there be what I think we euphemistically call a kinetic response from Western agents to this?
Apologies. So that's indeed extremely misinterpreted. I went off a rant there. Yeah, and indeed people have suggested it, but the complications are obvious, right? Like going after these people in Russia is a tricky thing to do.
But they've never stopped them in the past. The whole of Soviet Western thing has been killing each other.
Yeah, sure.
There's been no namby-pamby about it. They kill people.
Well,
let's come back to that because I will ask you about the full spectrum of response options open. So, but we had another question right here. So we just take this question first.
Sorry.
So we are talking about the criminal organizations, right? What about when the data is leaked by the Facebook or the X, Twitter, Instagram, and that's available in the dark web? So, are you going to hold the criminal group responsible, or the Facebook or the Twitter who couldn't maintain the confidentiality of the data? And do you think that the dark web, if you remove that thing from because it's anonymous, and if you remove the anonymity from the dark web, could that resolve the problem of the ransomware? And the third question is that how do you define national security when you're not even sure, like you told about the Russia, and you don't even know that the Russian government is responsible, or they don't even know the exact number or the people who are involved in that crime. So how do you define that it's a threat to the national security then?
Yeah. Hold that thought, because we're going to get onto the responses and we're getting a whole range of options.
I hope I'll remember them all three then still.
So a question here and then another here. I've written them down.
All right, thank you.
That'll be my job. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's a great talk. I was wondering if I could ask two related questions, as usual. The first one is, it's been recommended not to pay a ransom response. So what are the options available to, this is a very practical question, what are the options available to policymakers under that kind of constraint? And you mentioned also issues of ambiguity around identifying actors. We've seen a few kind of efforts to sanction or arrest these somewhat small-scale criminals. So is there any sort of perspective now on what can be done beyond maybe not paying them, or is that the best available right now? The second question I have is Costa Rica's declaration of ransomware as an act of war, does that suggest a foreign policy turn in terms of how cybercrime is viewed at sort of in the international level? It's a bit of a broader question.
Well, I'm going to boil these down into two questions. Did you want to add to that?
Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. It's very informative and it's actually very resonant with one course I have been taking with my supervisor on cybercrime. So you have mentioned this core figure in Conti, whose name is Stern, I believe. I think his legends are very similar to the founder of Carbon Planet, whose name I believe is Script. There's the epithet. So I want to know how they build up their managerial proficiency, as you mentioned. They have such a huge organization to run, and they have different departments. They have outsourcing and kind of these routine workers. So where do they build their managerial proficiency? Is that is there a region specific factor, or is there they practice with any socialization things? And yeah, thank you.
So if you take that one first, and then I can group the rest into two questions for you. I promise.
Script. Didn't he use lots of Godfather references?
Yeah,
was he a huge fan? Yes, reminds me of something. Anyway, so Stern, leader. How does he think? He thinks slightly differently than a lot of other people in the ransomware ecosystem. So he thinks industry-wide. So I have this chapter in the book on business expansion, and you can think about expanding your business in a number of different ways. One is to penetrate new markets. One is to penetrate users in your market that you weren't previously accessing. The other is product development, as we know from business literature. And the other one is diversification. This is the typical 4 ways in which you can think about business expansion. Now, what we saw with Conti is we saw them accessing new markets, particularly in Latin America. We also saw them changing a bit of focus on the type of companies that they were targeting as they were going over time to slightly bigger targets. And I have this figure in my book that showcases that over time they were going to targets with more and more revenue. Okay. What they didn't really do was good product development, if you could say so. So what other groups were doing is really improving on their encryption. And we haven't talked about this, but it's not an easy thing to do. How to write a good encryption device against a massive enterprise where you can very quickly encrypt a lot of data without getting noticed, and then also being able to decrypt it whilst you're in a hurry. That is not an easy task. You have to make interesting decisions about how and which files and how many files and when, etc. you're going to encrypt. The last version from Conti, their encryption device was worse than the previous versions, which seems to suggest they were not focusing on that. Now, Stern as a leader, however, was primarily focused on diversification. At some point, he seemed to get bored with ransomware, and he started to think about other industries. And he started to think about 3 in particular. The first one is he wanted to set up an entirely new social media platform, an almost Facebook-like platform, actually more like, I believe, similar to Chinese platforms, because they want to integrate payments, infrastructure, and so on there too. So here you have someone who really thinks about alternative opportunities. The other thing he wanted to do is he wanted to revive the carding market. So he wanted to go back to where Script started and really started to think about how they can do it in a better way. And he actually, started a website called the MacDuck Group, where he was trying to make this more efficient. And the third one, as it was a time with also COVID, where you saw this further rise in cryptocurrency, he was trying to do these pump and dump schemes. So buying up a random cryptocurrency, having this massive network of individuals that could speak on underground fora about ransomware, about this cryptocurrency, people buying it, creating this buzz, and then him dumping it. So you see someone actually that thinks very differently about businesses than some others do. So that's the question on sort of if you ask me about his business thinking, that's how he thinks about going on about expanding. Okay. Should I now touch upon the policy, or?
Well, there's a question about policy, but before we do that, was one of Zainab's questions and one of your questions were essentially about the national security threshold. So I think you more or less challenged it. Where you said, did Costa Rica, does that change the way the globe thinks about?
Yeah. So the key here is that it's not about whether it's connected to the Russian state or not, whether it's a national security threat. So I think that was the narrow thinking that I felt also held me back initially focusing on it, and the question that was asked when I started this research. So how is it connected to the Russian state? And if it is, then it's a national security threat. No, regardless of whether it is connected to the Russian state or not, we've seen them now, both when you think about risk being one of impact and likelihood, we've seen the likelihood of these incidents occurring having massively gone up. and the impact of those incidents being really severe. And this combination has meant that compared to any other cyber activity, but also national security activity more broadly, it is a threat which governments really have to put resources into.
And the Costa Rica, does that change?
And Costa Rica, yes. It really, there is a reason why, I don't know, yesterday they were nominated for the Policy Award, also in their international efforts, because it really has led to a change in thinking about how governments, first of all, have to respond to it, but second of all, have to potentially collaborate and assist each other in case those incidents occur. Now, at the same time, Costa Rica is a terrible example of thinking about what ransomware groups do against states, because it was an outlier. It was an outlier that is useful for me to open the book, but it's an outlier because it was done by these few individuals left at Conti that were essentially disgruntled by the core of the group having left, and disgruntled by the fact that there was no business under Conti anymore, going after Costa Rica, certainly not for for-profit reasons. They didn't expect to get paid out massively. This was more of like a screw you operation. And so it's different than others who are more carefully thinking about which government entity to hit to get my 2 million payout.
So let me frame the policy response question. And firstly, I can't help but note that, as with all good cybersecurity experts, you and I have spent more than 3/4 of our allocated time admiring the problem, and then we'll just rush in the discussion about remedies at the end, and that's very much in keeping with the subject. But in terms of the questions we've just had from around the room, and actually some of them online, which I'll come to in a bit. So at Virtual Roots, you track counter-ransomware initiatives. The suggestions we've had, I think, from around the room, and I'll add a few, span the full spectrum. We've had Zainab sort of, in a sense, saying, hold the tech providers, but also the organizations accountable for their own security. They have to have minimum standards. It's kind of sometimes at least their fault. We've had, tackle the dark web ecosystem, maybe anonymity with the whole thing, which I would add about cryptocurrencies. We've had the point about not paying ransoms, ransom bans, restrictions, and so forth, all the way through to the other end of the spectrum, from perhaps focusing on defensive measures by victims to, covert assassinations, which has been, at least semi-seriously suggested in parts of the US. So I suppose the question is, because you track this expertly, there's a lot about it in your book, which of these things do you think, would you like to see more of, less of, and what works? Assuming, of course, that we're not arresting these people physically, and that's the one thing we're not doing.
Yeah, that's a key question. And actually, it starts with a key point, and perhaps the most important observation of my book, that that we haven't talked about.
Sorry.
And that is, no, that's my fault. Obviously not yours. And that is what I call the ransomware trust paradox. It's a simple principle. Ransomware groups need to deceive their victim to get access, encrypt data. But these ransomware groups also need to get the trust of their victim. They need to get that trust to be perceived as both reliable and skillful. I'm not going to pay several million or even $100,000 if I don't believe that you are following up on your promises. So if I am, they need to be perceived as, if I'm going to pay you this million, I'm getting my decryptor. Or if I'm paying this million, you're indeed not going to leak my data online. So it's the skillfulness and reliableness. And so the key question for ransomware groups is, how do I overcome the ransomware trust paradox? How do I gain trust of victims? So the game here is not necessarily on how do I get access to a network. That's actually relatively easy. How do I gain the trust? Without it, I cannot be profitable. And so the question then is, how do they get that? And there are a number of different ways in which they do this. We know from typical business literature, of course, is that if you are operating in a very professional manner, then people are more likely to trust you. So as simple as that. And so, it's a real signaling mechanism if a ransomware group has this very shiny portal for you to chat with them and negotiate. It gives you a sense of I'm operating here against a real, team of business. Equally, we know like in the same way for any business, an example that is something used is with car vendors. You are more likely to buy a car if you've been able to test that car before, right? A demonstration of capability. We see this with ransomware groups writing in their ransom note. You can send us any file that you want to have decrypted, and we will decrypt it for free. It's for them to showcase that they're able to do that. But the key way in which they develop trust is through reputation management and brand building. It's by repeatedly following up on supposedly their promises and then having people to ride on that. So the worst thing that can happen is that when you type in the name of this ransomware group, all the search results from Google say, this group, after you've paid millions, does not pay out. Then they have to rebrand. No one is going to do it anymore. And this reputation is one that comes from our engagement. You, me, threat intel community, governments, journalism, we often help them building up this reputation and brand as we publish on them. And it's very, very different from state activity. China doesn't want you to publish on their IP theft operations. They will do, there will be some plausible deniability that they seek to build in there. Very different from ransomware. If you publish on them, if they get out there and you write stories, they want to have that attention. It builds them up in their reputation, and you will see groups celebrating that in a variety of different ways. So all of what these groups, or what is a key point for these groups, is really, again, managing that. How do I set up my leak site? Do I add a frequently asked questions page? So, people know what we're up to, etc. They might write press releases. They might engage as a result of a difference with victims. They might have to think about rebranding. Like, do I set up one brand, a mother brand, and operate from there? Or do I do multiple brands? All of these questions are essential with ransomware. And it's needed to discuss this prior to going to the policy responses. It's because if trust is the key way in which they can only be profitable, it's trying to undermine that trust to actually, and have that as a policy focus. Mm-hmm. And to specify here, right, this is trust between the victim and the ransomware group. It's, of course, trust between operators is important too, but that's exist in any criminal space. But it's really that element of trust. Now to your question, sorry, Ciaran, around how to deal with it. What we have seen in this space is a lot of activity that was disrupting ransomware, or is disrupting ransomware, in the same way as we do with state actors. So going after their command and control infrastructure, or going after how they get paid out, or publishing warnings that this new group is emerging and you have to be careful about how they get access. We've also seen them, going after some organizational elements, sanctioning individuals, etc. But undermining that trust is something that we have hardly seen, with really the UK NCA standing out as a not illustrative case, but an exceptional case, where there was a clear focus on doing this, particularly with this case called the Lockbit takedown last year. If you ask me where do we have to move, it's primarily in that space, where we have to think about disconnecting or decreasing the trust that
so are you saying that things like, never mind, what some people would see as extreme as, covert assassinations, but in terms of a lot of focus of things, I used to work on like requiring the improvement of defenses or the suggestion of a payments ban. Those aren't aimed at disrupting trust. Those are aimed at, one is, the first one, increasing defenses, is just making it less likely to happen. The second is aimed at stopping them getting paid, mm-hmm. but not through undermining the trust model, just stopping them getting paid. Mm-hmm. Do you think then, given that analysis, that those are wastes of time, or?
They're not wastes of time, and we should continue to do them. And they can have an impact on the ecosystem by taking down, for instance, especially going after big groups. What we have seen, mm-hmm. what happens is you go after a big group. It might lead to them having to rebrand, reorganize into smaller groups, right? We see a variety of different things, and it clearly has an impact on the ecosystem. But we but I do think, so I'm not saying we should only focus on, sowing this distrust, but it should be if you're asking me about where the focus should be, I think that's an important one. So going back, all the stages of their playbook, we should disrupt them. So how they get access, okay, let's publish how they get access so we can avoid it. How they leverage that access, let's think about those tools and let's maybe, withdraw licenses and so on. How they set up command and control infrastructure, let's take that command and control infrastructure down. If they're using cryptocurrency exchanges and tumblers that are based in Western countries and that are violating, policies, let's, sanction those. If they go after money moves, we should do all of that. But indeed, I don't think by just going after that, you're indeed solving the problem. Okay. And sometimes you might just shift the problem. And payment bans actually might be a good example of that. Payment bans can shift the problem, I think, in two ways, depending on how they are set up. First way is if you have selective payment bans, so for certain industries or not, right? And if you then especially if you then work with licensing where the most sensitive industries can get essentially a license to pay in case the national security consequences are too severe, because it means that they become a target, okay? So that there is one way in which it can shift, but the other way that payment bans can shift dynamics is by changing in countries' focus. And this is not something that you will find, I feel, in policy documents because it's a hard one to write on, but it's definitely one where if the UK would do a payment ban, it's not just that I don't think that UK government officials truly believe that it makes ransomware go away. But the hope is that ransomware will go elsewhere. They won't target the UK, but they will target France. Much better, all these countries, that is a bit there, that shift. But I don't believe that they believe, only if you would have a worldwide ban on payments, then you would solve the ransomware problem.
Well, you've accidentally hit on a sore point for me there, because once when I was in office for the UK government, my chief technical officer went and gave a speech in Australia where he said that his job was not to stop cybercrime, it was to send it to France. Which,
there you go. If I know where to put that quote in my book,
you might have thought that he was a bit more digitally savvy and that things in Australia would get picked around. But actually, just seriously, and we've only got a few minutes left, so let's be quick on this. I mean, in this age of assertive national power, why wouldn't you do that? If the rest of the world can't be bothered to ban payments, why wouldn't you do it?
I'm not saying it's a bad... No. I'm not saying it's a bad national policy. Yeah. I'm saying it doesn't solve ransomware. And that's an important one, right? Like, I am not a government official, and if people ask me, how do you solve ransomware? No, I'd much rather think about the ways in which, indeed, the NCA took down Lockbit. And what did they do? They weren't just focused on how they took it down, but they were going to all the reporters, and probably including you and also me, to say why they can't be trusted. They don't delete your data really after you've paid. And look what the consequences are. You actually potentially have seen a drop in current payments, at least according to some, like chain analysis, and some of that has been attributed to that.
This has been fascinating, but I can see people are getting thirsty on a Friday afternoon. So I'm going to ask one last question, and it's partly in deference to at least 3 questions from Ileana S. Young and CR Online, which are about vulnerabilities. It also reflects my own sort of obsession with, perhaps putting in a word for the need to raise defensive standards. And also, it takes you back to your scholarly original form of a scholar of cyber war, conflict, etc., etc. What ransomware has done, what the ransomware attacks have done, and which is why you've categorized it as a national security threat in your book, is shown just how easy it can be, perhaps not with mass casualties, but with real disruption and damage to life and limb through healthcare and so on, how easy it is to mess up societies through cyber attack. They've taken out pipelines, they've disrupted hospitals, food retail, you name it, it's all in the book. So I suppose 2 questions. One is it realistic for countries to at least reduce those vulnerabilities? And secondly, is this not, and I'm almost hesitant to ask this in case anybody gets any ideas, but it's so obvious I think we have to ask it, is this not a playbook for the people you used to study before this book to say, look, let's just do all of this. We don't need to demand money for it. Let's do it for political reasons. Let's do it as an extension of state power. Let's do it, frankly, as an act of war or near war. Is this not showing people all across the world who might be more politically motivated rather than financially motivated, which is these people? I mean, is this not a serious set of vulnerabilities, regardless of who's attacking? And what can we do about that? Have the criminals accidentally given a geopolitical playbook to people that we're even much more strategically worried about?
This is a great question to answer, to ask, and I hope I can do justice in answering it as the last question to you, Ciaran. So, yeah, and I do think that states have come to realize like the consequences that criminals have and are learning. And there's a learning process right now going on that goes both ways, unquestionably. I don't think, though, that there are many governments in the world that have an incentive to dramatically go after, variety of different businesses and organizations in other countries. And here is one thing that these cyber criminal groups tend to do. They are still quite opportunistic, right? And indeed, it can cause major societal consequences, but they will go after one entity. If it doesn't work, they go after the next. They're not going to spend 3 months going after one entity because, that is a waste of money. You can better go to the next. State actors tend to operate slightly differently, right? As a state, you might have interest in one specific entity. You're going to find a way to go after that entity. You might have to go through a different one. So you see a slightly different playbook in targeting going on, but unquestionably, I do think that what these criminal groups have shown, not just to states, but even to academics, is this true ability of relatively low-skilled individuals to cause major damage, and that should be a concern.
On that partly optimistic, but also quite chilling note, it just remains for me to, well, first of all, this is the book, Ransom War. Max will be outside. I should also say that for those of you who know me and who know my enthusiasm for junk food, I have never quite had a present of this quality before, which is book-branded crisps from Max, which I look forward to enjoying enormously. So look forward to seeing this on social media. But mostly, thank you to everybody online. For those here, drinks are outside, but please do show your appreciation to the magnificent Dr. Max Smeets for his talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Ciaran. It's a pleasure. Thank you.